3 weddings, 3 families, and 3 women who never raised their voices but still managed to destroy everything. One bride watched her mother-in-law cry in front of 200 guests, and somehow she became the villain. Another groom slowly lost his entire family because his wife was always the one being hurt. And in the last wedding, a single speech paid for with money and wrapped in sacrifice changed the power dynamic forever. These weren't accidents, they weren't misunderstandings, and they definitely weren't about love. They were about playing the victim at exactly the right moment and letting everyone else do the damage. In this video, I'm taking you behind 3 weddings where tears were used as weapons. Sympathy became leverage, and the person everyone felt sorry for was the one pulling the strings. If you've ever wondered how a perfect wedding collapses without anyone ever yelling, or how one person's pain can quietly rewrite an entire family, you're about to see exactly how it happens. I'm Emily Carter. I'm a wedding planner, and I've seen these moments up close, long before the guests realized anything was wrong. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our wedding stories. And if you're already here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The first wedding that comes to mind whenever I hear someone say, "she just feels left out," took place in Charleston, South Carolina. At a historic waterfront venue that looked like it belonged on the cover of a bridal magazine. Soft white columns, sweeping oaks, water glinting in the background, it was the kind of setting people assume guarantees a happy ending. The bride's name was Claire Whitmore. She was thoughtful, organized, and quietly exhausted in that way I recognize instantly now. The groom, Logan Whitmore, loved her deeply, but he carried a kind of emotional tension that never fully left his shoulders. And then there was his mother, Evelyn Whitmore. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't make dramatic demands. In fact, when I first met her, I remember thinking she was refreshingly hands-off for a mother-in-law funding part of an upscale Southern wedding. She smiled politely, spoke softly, and kept her comments vague, almost too vague. She would say things like, "I don't want to be in the way," or "I know this isn't really my place," while somehow always being present when decisions were made. She framed every concern as a feeling, never a demand, and that made her impossible to challenge without looking cruel. From the very beginning, Claire tried. She included Evelyn in tastings, asked her opinion on floral styles, even invited her to a dress fitting that most brides would keep sacred. But nothing seemed to land. Every gesture was met with a small sigh, a tight smile, a comment about how things are just different now. The first real tension appeared around the guest list. Charleston venues are beautiful, but they are unforgiving when it comes to capacity. Every additional chair ripples through catering, rentals, and layout approvals. Claire and Logan had agreed on a number that fit both their budget and the space. A week later, Logan called me sounding uneasy. He said his mother felt hurt, not angry, not demanding, hurt. Apparently, she had discovered that several distant cousins and longtime family friends weren't on the list. People she believed would expect to be there. When Claire gently explained the limitations, Evelyn didn't argue. She simply said she felt excluded from the process. That she worried Claire didn't respect the family's traditions. That she felt like a guest at her own son's wedding. I remember standing in the venue office, phone pressed to my ear, feeling that familiar tightening in my stomach. Because I'd heard this before, when someone frames logistics as emotional rejection, the conversation stops being about facts and starts being about loyalty. Logan began making adjustments without looping Claire in. A few names added here, a few minor changes there. Each one justified as keeping the peace. Each one subtly shifting the balance of power. Then came the ceremony seating. In Southern weddings, this is not a small detail. Where someone sits says everything about their status, their role, their importance. Claire had planned a layout that honored both families equally. Evelyn saw it differently. She never demanded a change. She simply mentioned, tearfully, that sitting where she was placed made her feel invisible. that people would talk, that she worried others might think she'd done something wrong as a mother. By the time the rehearsal rolled around, the seating had been rearranged. Quietly, without Claire's approval, I watched Claire stand there, hands clasped, trying to understand how decisions kept being made around her instead of with her. I watched Logan avoid her eyes, caught between his mother's wounded expressions and his fiancé's growing confusion. And I knew then, long before the wedding day arrived, that this wasn't about being left out at all. This was about control, disguised as pain. At that point, the lines were already blurring. Private conversations were being reframed. Small disagreements were becoming character flaws, and the story being told behind Claire's back was no longer the one she thought she was living. What happened next didn't explode all at once. It unfolded slowly, politely, and in full view of everyone who believed Evelyn was simply a mother struggling to let go. And that's when the real test began. In my line of work, there's a moment when you can tell whether a family conflict will settle quietly or spiral. It's not when someone raises their voice. It's when someone realizes they can push just a little further and still be comforted instead of corrected. With Evelyn, that realization came quickly, after the seating changes. Claire tried to reclaim some sense of control in the only way she could without seeming confrontational. She asked that all final decisions go through her and Logan together. It was a reasonable request. It was also, apparently, devastating. Evelyn didn't argue. She didn't protest. She cried, not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough to make Logan panic. She told him she felt like she was being shut out. That ever since Claire came into his life, she felt she had to watch her step. That she was afraid to speak because she didn't want to upset anyone. And the way she said it, you would have thought Claire had issued some kind of ultimatum instead of asking for basic communication. Logan came to me afterward, standing near the catering prep area, lowering his voice as if his mother might overhear him from across the city. He asked if it would be possible to run a few things by Evelyn first, just to make her feel included. I remember staring at him for a second longer than was polite. Because once a third party becomes the emotional gatekeeper, the couple is no longer planning their wedding, they're negotiating a ceasefire. Claire noticed the shift almost immediately. Emails she was copied on now arrived after decisions were already made. Vendor calls she'd scheduled were suddenly rescheduled to accommodate Evelyn's availability. Even small things, like the wording of the program, were filtered through how his mother might feel seeing it printed. Every time Claire pushed back, she was careful, calm, respectful, and every time Evelyn responded the same way. She took the disagreement and translated it into emotional injury. She would say things like, "I didn't realize my opinion wasn't welcome," or "I guess I just don't matter here." Statements that sounded fragile but landed like accusations. The most painful moment came during a dress-related conversation. Claire had chosen a gown that was elegant but modern. When Evelyn saw a photo, she paused just long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. Then said she was surprised Claire hadn't chosen something more traditional, considering the family's values. Later that night, Logan called Claire and asked if she'd be open to a different dress style. Not because he disliked it, not because it didn't fit the wedding, but because his mother was having a hard time recognizing the ceremony she'd imagined. That was the moment Claire finally said out loud what had been building for weeks. She said she felt erased, that she felt like a guest in her own wedding, that every boundary she tried to set turned into proof that she was cold or ungrateful. Logan listened, he hugged her, and then he asked her to be patient. Patience, I've learned, is often the word used when someone wants you to endure something instead of change it. As the wedding day crept closer, the emotional pressure intensified. Evelyn began checking in constantly, always under the guise of concern. Was Claire stressed? Was she eating enough? Was she overwhelmed? Each question framed Claire as fragile, unstable, in need of guidance. And when Claire pulled back, Evelyn took that distance and used it as confirmation. She told relatives she felt Claire didn't like her, that she was trying so hard, but nothing was ever enough. By the time out-of-town guests started arriving in Charleston, the narrative had already been written for them. A sensitive mother, a distant bride, a son caught in the middle. Watching it unfold, I felt that familiar sinking feeling again. Because boundary tests don't look like aggression. They look like sadness. And by the time everyone realizes what's happening, the person who set the boundary is already cast as the villain. The wedding day itself was approaching fast. And with an audience now fully in place, Evelyn no longer needed to be subtle. She just needed a moment. Wedding days compress everything. Emotions, expectations, unresolved tension. What might have taken months to surface in normal life suddenly has nowhere to hide. The morning of Claire and Logan's wedding was warm and bright, the kind of southern morning that feels deceptively calm. Claire arrived early, calm on the surface, focused on timelines and details. She was trying to hold on to the version of the day she'd imagined, even as it kept slipping through her fingers. Evelyn arrived later than scheduled, not late enough to cause a scene, just late enough to shift the rhythm. She greeted everyone warmly, embraced relatives she hadn't seen in years, and made a point of stopping by me with a soft smile and a quiet comment about how emotional she was feeling. She said she hoped she wouldn't cry during the ceremony because she was already so overwhelmed. That word again, overwhelmed, as if something was being done to her. As guests took their seats, I noticed small changes that hadn't been approved. Chairs adjusted, a row subtly rearranged. When I asked one of the ushers, he looked uncomfortable and said Logan's mother had asked for a minor correction to avoid awkwardness. I felt my stomach drop. Claire was in the bridal suite when she found out. Someone mentioned it casually, assuming she already knew. I watched the color drain from her face as she realized her mother-in-law had repositioned family members without saying a word to her. She didn't cry. She just went very quiet. I've learned that silence in those moments isn't calm. It's containment. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Claire walked down the aisle steady and composed, even as she noticed the seating changes out of the corner of her eye. Logan looked emotional but distracted, scanning the front rows more than he should have been. And then came the reception. Toasts are emotional landmines. Everyone knows that, which is why they're usually reviewed, timed, and tightly controlled. Evelyn hadn't insisted on giving a speech. She'd simply mentioned, weeks earlier, how meaningful it would be to say a few words if Claire was comfortable. Claire, exhausted from choosing which battles to fight, had agreed. Evelyn stood up, holding her glass with both hands. Her voice trembled just enough to sound sincere. She talked about how hard it is for a mother to let go, about how weddings change family dynamics, about how sometimes you don't know where you fit anymore. Then she paused. She thanked Logan for always being kind, always being patient, always trying to keep everyone together. And then she looked directly at Claire and said she hoped, with time, they could grow closer too. The room went quiet. It wasn't an insult, it was worse. It implied distance. It suggested effort was wanted, and in front of 200 people, it cemented the narrative Evelyn had been quietly building for months. I watched Claire smile and nod, her jaw tight. I watched relatives exchange looks. I watched the moment land exactly as intended. After the speech, people approached Evelyn with hugs. They told her how brave she was, how beautifully she'd spoken, how difficult this transition must be for her. Claire, meanwhile, was congratulated on her dress, the flowers, the food. No one asked how she felt. Later that evening, I found her standing alone near the edge of the reception space, staring out toward the water. She told me she felt humiliated, not loudly, not angrily, just matter of fact, like someone naming a truth they could no longer ignore. She said she finally understood that nothing she did would ever be enough. Because the story required her to be the problem. Logan tried to smooth things over. He said his mother hadn't meant anything by it, that she was just emotional, that everyone knew how sensitive she was. Sensitive. Another word that asks others to accommodate instead of confront. By the end of the night, the damage was done. The wedding hadn't exploded. It had cracked. quietly, publicly, permanently. And while most guests went home believing they'd witnessed a touching family moment, Claire went home knowing something else entirely, that this wasn't going to end when the wedding did. In the weeks after a wedding, reality settles in. The adrenaline fades, the photos arrive, thank you notes get written. And for most couples, that's when life finally feels like it can begin. For Claire, it was when the quiet consequences started showing up everywhere. At first, it was subtle. Family dinners where conversations felt strained. Group messages where her replies were met with polite delays. Invitations that came through Logan, not her. She could feel herself being discussed without being present, her absence slowly becoming part of the story. Evelyn didn't confront her. She didn't argue. She did something far more effective. She shared her feelings. She told relatives she was trying to give the newlyweds space, but that she felt unsure where she stood. She said she worried she'd overstepped without realizing it. She wondered aloud whether she'd done something to offend Claire. Every sentence positioned her as reflective, wounded, reasonable. Claire found out when a well-meaning aunt called her one afternoon and gently suggested she make more of an effort. The aunt said Evelyn had been so emotional since the wedding, and it might help to reassure her that everything was okay. Claire sat on the couch listening, realizing that the narrative had fully escaped her control. She wasn't being accused directly, she was being pitied around. Logan, caught in the middle, tried to mediate. He suggested a lunch. Just the three of them, a chance to clear the air. The lunch took place at a quiet restaurant, neutral territory. Evelyn arrived early. She hugged Claire tightly, longer than necessary, and immediately commented on how different things felt now. As soon as they sat down, Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. She said she'd been replaying the wedding in her mind, wondering where she'd gone wrong. She said she never intended to make Claire feel uncomfortable, but she felt so shut out that day, so unsure of her place. Claire listened. She waited, and when she finally spoke, she explained calmly how the seating changes and the speech had made her feel undermined and humiliated. Evelyn looked genuinely shocked. She said she had no idea Claire felt that way, that if she'd known, she never would have spoken. That she was devastated to learn she'd caused pain when all she wanted was connection. Then she added something that shifted the room. She said she worried Claire might be projecting stress onto her. That weddings can be overwhelming for brides, that maybe emotions had gotten tangled. I wasn't there, but when Claire described it to me later, she said it felt like watching the ground move beneath her feet. Her feelings were acknowledged, then quietly dismissed as misinterpretations. Logan left that lunch drained and confused. He told Claire he believed her, but he also believed his mother hadn't meant harm. He asked if they could all just move forward. Move forward, I've learned, often means move past without accountability. The real consequence came a few weeks later at a family gathering. Claire attended reluctantly. Conversations stopped when she entered the room. Smiles were polite but guarded. Someone joked about how mothers always get emotional at weddings, and several people laughed knowingly. That was the moment Claire realized the cost of staying quiet. She confronted Evelyn directly. Later that evening, away from the crowd, she didn't raise her voice, she didn't accuse. She simply said she could no longer accept being framed as distant or cold when she'd been systematically sidelined. Evelyn didn't deny it. She said she felt attacked. She said she couldn't believe Claire would speak to her that way after everything she'd done. She said she felt unsafe expressing herself around her daughter-in-law, and just like that, the final role was assigned. Claire was no longer misunderstood. She was threatening. Within days, the relationship collapsed completely. Messages went unanswered. Invitations stopped coming. Logan was forced, for the first time, to see the pattern he'd been cushioning himself from. He saw how every attempt at clarity became another story about his mother's suffering. There was no dramatic fallout, no shouting match, just distance. Permanent and deliberate, and for Evelyn, the story remained intact. She was the mother who tried, the woman who was pushed aside, the one everyone felt sorry for. But for Claire, the consequence was something else entirely. Freedom came at the cost of reputation. And sometimes that's the price of stepping out of someone else's story. By the time Claire stopped trying to repair the relationship, something inside her had already shifted. She told me later that the hardest part wasn't losing Evelyn, it was accepting that no version of patience, kindness, or restraint would ever have changed the outcome. The story had been written long before the wedding invitations went out. She had just played her assigned role longer than she should have. Logan struggled in ways he didn't expect. Once the noise faded, once the relatives stopped calling, and the holidays passed quietly, he began replaying moments he'd brushed aside. The phone calls framed as concern. The decisions justified as peacekeeping. The way his mother's hurt always required someone else to shrink. He admitted something to me a few months after the wedding, standing beside Claire at a charity event they attended together. He said he'd confused emotional intensity with truth. That he'd believed whoever felt the most pain must be the one being wronged. That realization didn't repair the damage, but it changed the marriage. Claire stopped explaining herself. She stopped attending conversations designed to extract apologies she didn't owe, and slowly, as the distance settled into something stable, she felt lighter than she had in years. Evelyn, from what I heard through the family grapevine, never stopped telling her version. She remained wounded, she remained excluded, and she remained surrounded by people who rewarded her suffering with sympathy. But Claire no longer needed to be part of that cycle. When I look back on that wedding now, I don't remember the flowers or the view or even the moment they exchanged vows. I remember the silence afterward, the kind that follows when someone finally steps out of a role they were never meant to play. And I remember thinking how often I'd seen this exact pattern repeat. Because sometimes the most effective manipulation doesn't come from anger or control or open hostility. It comes from someone who always needs to be the injured party. And once you see that, you start noticing it everywhere. Not just in mothers-in-law. Sometimes it shows up in brides too. That realization came sharply into focus at a vineyard in Napa Valley, where the problem wasn't a mother who felt excluded, it was a wife who needed to be at the wedding. In Napa Valley looked flawless from the outside. Rolling vineyards, long wooden tables under strings of warm lights, glasses clinking as the sun dipped behind the hills. It was the kind of setting that makes people assume love must be uncomplicated to afford something so serene. I met Ruby Kensington during one of our first planning calls. She had a soft voice, impeccable manners, and a way of speaking that made every concern sound like an apology. She worried about being a burden. She worried about being misunderstood. She worried constantly about whether people truly liked her. Isaac Kensington, her fiancé, was attentive and eager to please. He deferred to Ruby often, checking her expression before answering questions, adjusting his tone when she seemed uncertain. At first glance, it looked like care, and for a while, that's what everyone believed it was. Isaac's parents, especially his mother Jean, were cautious but welcoming. They lived comfortably, not extravagantly, and had offered to contribute financially to the wedding in ways that felt generous but measured. Napa weddings are expensive, even when budgets are healthy, and every contribution carries weight, whether anyone says it out loud or not. Ruby spoke often about feeling like an outsider. She mentioned, casually at first, that she worried Isaac's family never fully accepted her. That sometimes comments felt pointed, even when no one else seemed to notice. She would say it gently, as if she were questioning her own perceptions, rather than accusing anyone. I've learned to pay attention when someone consistently feels harmed by neutral interactions. Not because they're always wrong, but because feelings, when repeated often enough, start shaping reality. Early on, Ruby asked that most communication go through her seat. She said it helped her manage stress. Isaac agreed immediately. Jean adjusted without complaint. Messages became shorter, more careful. Invitations to family dinners were extended through Isaac, filtered through Ruby's emotional temperature at the time. Whenever Jean tried to engage directly, Ruby felt overwhelmed. She worried she was being judged. She worried she was being pressured. And Isaac, desperate to protect her, began pulling back on his own. Small things became loaded. A suggestion about wine selection, a comment about guest accommodations. Each one was later described by Ruby as hurtful, dismissive, or proof that she didn't belong. Jean was confused. She told me once quietly that she felt like she was constantly stepping on something invisible, that she didn't know what she was doing wrong, only that she was always apologizing for it. The deeper we got into planning, the more Ruby framed herself as the emotional buffer between Isaac and his family. She said she didn't want him stressed. She said she could handle it. She said she just needed him to trust her. And he did. By the time the vineyard walkthrough happened, Ruby and Jean were barely speaking. Not because of any open conflict. Because Ruby said distance felt safer. I remember standing among the vines, watching Isaac trail behind Ruby, his phone already buzzing with unanswered messages from his parents. He looked torn, but resolved. As if choosing her meant choosing silence elsewhere. At that point, it still looked like a sensitive bride navigating a difficult dynamic. But I'd seen this pattern before, and I knew that when someone's identity becomes the injured party, every interaction starts serving that story. The real shift didn't happen in public. It happened quietly, through messages no one else saw. And once those messages began to twist, there was no neutral ground left. The first boundary Ruby tested wasn't loud. It didn't look like control, it looked like vulnerability. She told Isaac she was struggling emotionally, that interactions with his parents left her anxious for days, that she replayed conversations in her head, wondering what she'd done wrong. She said she felt small around them, unseen, always on the outside. Isaac responded the way many partners do when they believe love means protection. He reassured her. He listened. And slowly, without announcing it, he began adjusting his behavior. He delayed returning his mother's calls, he shortened visits, he stopped sharing details about planning unless Ruby approved them first. When Jean asked if everything was okay, Isaac told her Ruby was just overwhelmed and needed space. Space is a reasonable request until it becomes a permanent condition. Ruby began sharing screenshots with Isaac, messages from his mother, highlighted and reframed. A simple question about guest travel turned into pressure. A comment about timing became criticism. Even neutral phrases were interpreted as passive-aggressive. Isaac didn't see the original tone anymore. He saw Ruby's reaction to it, and that reaction carried more weight than intent ever could. Jean sensed the distance growing. She tried to address it gently, inviting Ruby to lunch, suggesting they talk things through. Ruby declined. She said she didn't feel safe enough yet, that she needed more time. Time, in this case, became leverage. As the wedding approached, Ruby asked Isaac to stop discussing family matters with his parents entirely. She said it helped her feel secure. She said she needed to know he was fully on her side. Isaac hesitated. It was the first time he did. Ruby cried. She said she felt abandoned. She asked why her feelings mattered less than his parents' comfort. She said she couldn't believe she had to compete for emotional loyalty. That was the moment the line was crossed. Isaac agreed. He told his parents they needed to respect boundaries. He didn't specify what those boundaries were, only that they existed because Ruby was hurting. Jean was stunned. She apologized anyway. From that point on, every interaction was filtered through Ruby's pain. If Jean reached out, Ruby felt attacked. If she stayed silent, Ruby felt rejected. There was no version of engagement that didn't reinforce Ruby's position as the wounded party. Financial tension followed naturally. Isaac's parents had offered to cover part of the reception costs. Ruby began expressing discomfort with the arrangement. She said it made her feel controlled, that money came with expectations. She suggested they decline the contribution. Isaac told his parents they would handle the rest themselves. Jean cried when she told me about it, not because of the money, because it felt like a door closing. Another piece of her son's life suddenly off limits. The boundary had been tested, and it had held, which meant Ruby no longer needed to ask. She could simply expect. By the time the wedding weekend arrived, Isaac was barely speaking to his parents unless absolutely necessary. Ruby framed the distance as healing, as self-care, as protection, and anyone who questioned it, even gently, was proof that she'd never truly been accepted. The vineyard filled with guests who saw only a soft-spoken bride and a devoted groom. They didn't see the conversations that had been rewritten, the connections quietly severed, but the damage was already embedded. Because once someone convinces you they are always being hurt, the next step is deciding who's allowed to stay in your life at all. And Ruby was getting ready to make that decision permanent. The escalation didn't arrive with shouting or accusations. It arrived wrapped in certainty. By the time the wedding weekend began, Ruby spoke as if the situation with Isaac's family was already resolved. She referred to the distance as necessary, healthy. I heard her say more than once that some families simply couldn't respect boundaries and that letting go was part of growing up. Isaac nodded along, but there was a tension in him I hadn't seen before. Not doubt exactly, more like fatigue, the kind that comes from constantly managing someone else's emotional state. On the morning of the wedding, Jean sent a message asking if she could stop by the bridal suite to wish Ruby well. It was a simple request, polite, careful. Ruby read it, exhaled sharply, and handed the phone to Isaac. She said she wasn't ready, that seeing Jean would spike her anxiety, that she didn't want to be emotionally destabilized before walking down the aisle. Isaac texted his mother back, apologizing, telling her it was better if they connected later. Jean stayed away. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Guests commented on how calm Ruby looked, how centered, how grounded. No one noticed that Isaac's parents were seated slightly farther back than planned, or that their interaction with the couple was limited to brief smiles and distant congratulations. At the reception, Ruby moved easily among her friends, laughing, glowing, entirely at home. Isaac stayed close to her side, glancing occasionally toward his parents' table, as if checking whether they were okay. Ruby noticed later that evening she pulled him aside and asked why he kept looking over there. Her tone was soft, but the question landed heavily. Isaac said he was just checking in. She told him it made her feel unsafe, like he was prioritizing their feelings over hers on their wedding day. He apologized. That pattern repeated itself again and again over the next few months. Every time Isaac mentioned his parents, Ruby grew distant. Every attempt at reconnection was framed as betrayal. She said she felt like she was reliving the same pain over and over. She said she didn't understand why he couldn't let go. She said she needed him to choose, and he did. Phone calls went unanswered. Holidays passed quietly. Invitations were declined without explanation. Ruby framed the silence as peace, but peace built on erasure doesn't last. The turning point came almost a year later, when Isaac's father fell ill. Jean reached out, desperate, asking for support. Ruby read the message and immediately shut down. She said it felt manipulative, that crises were often used to pull people back into unhealthy dynamics. Isaac hesitated longer this time. For the first time, he asked to see the messages Ruby had always summarized for him, not the screenshots she selected. The full threads? Ruby resisted. She said it would re-traumatize her. That word stopped him cold. Because trauma doesn't usually require secrecy. When he finally saw the messages, something shifted. He saw neutral statements reframed as attacks. Concern twisted into control. Apologies that were never enough. He didn't confront Ruby right away. He grew quiet, observant, and Ruby noticed that too. She accused him of pulling away, of siding with people who had never respected her, of invalidating her pain. This time, he didn't reassure her. The escalation reached its peak, not in a public argument, but in a private realization. Isaac understood that the role of victim required constant reinforcement, and that if it ever stopped working, the story would collapse. The marriage began to strain under the weight of that truth, because once isolation becomes a condition of love, love itself starts to disappear. The truth didn't come out all at once. It rarely does. It surfaced in fragments, through awkward pauses, unanswered questions, and the slow return of people Isaac hadn't spoken to in months. Once he stopped automatically defending Ruby's version of events, the silence around him began to fill in on its own. Jean was the first to notice the shift. Isaac called her one evening, his voice tentative, almost unfamiliar. He didn't apologize, he didn't explain. He just asked how she was. She cried, not because she wanted to guilt him, but because she hadn't known if she'd ever hear his voice again. That call cracked something open. Conversations followed, careful at first, then longer, more detailed. Jean shared messages she'd sent that Isaac had never seen, threads Ruby had summarized but never shown, context that had quietly disappeared over time. Isaac compared them to what he remembered being told. The gap was impossible to ignore. He started recognizing moments that suddenly made sense, why his parents had stopped pushing, why they sounded resigned instead of defensive, why apologies had always come so quickly, because they were responding to a version of events they didn't recognize but felt powerless to challenge. As Isaac reconnected with extended family, similar stories emerged. Cousins who had felt iced out, an aunt who'd been told Ruby wasn't ready to talk yet, a pattern of exclusion that no one had named out loud because everyone believed Ruby was fragile. The public consequence wasn't a confrontation, it was exposure, quiet, undeniable, and devastating. Ruby noticed the shift almost immediately. Isaac no longer shared everything with her. He didn't flinch when she expressed discomfort about his family. He asked questions. He paused instead of apologizing. She accused him of changing, of being influenced, of choosing people who had never supported her. When he told her he needed honesty, not protection, she said he was invalidating her lived experience. That phrase came up often after that, but it no longer carried the same weight. The social circle around them changed to friends who'd once unquestioningly supported Ruby's narrative began pulling back. Invitations became less frequent. Conversations more guarded. People didn't confront her. They just stopped affirming the story. And without that affirmation, Ruby's role became harder to sustain. The marriage unraveled quietly. Counseling didn't help because every session returned to the same place. Ruby needed her pain to be unquestionable. Isaac needed shared reality. They separated less than a year after the wedding. There was no dramatic announcement, just a slow retreat from joint appearances, a move into separate spaces, a silence that felt heavier than any argument. Publicly, Ruby remained the victim. She told people the marriage ended because Isaac couldn't protect her from his family. Some believed her, but enough people had seen enough. Isaac rebuilt what he could. Not fully, some bonds don't return to what they were. Too much time had passed, too many moments missed. The cost of isolation lingered. When he told me about the separation, he didn't sound angry. He sounded older, like someone who'd learned too late that love doesn't require erasing everyone else. And as painful as it was, he said something that stayed with me. He said the hardest part wasn't losing the marriage. It was realizing how easily he'd handed over the map of his relationships to someone else. When everything finally settled, there was no sense of victory for anyone involved. Only clarity. And clarity, I've learned, is often the most painful outcome of all. Isaac moved slowly after the separation. He didn't rush to repair relationships or reclaim lost time as if nothing had happened. He understood that trust doesn't reset just because intentions change. Some wounds stay tender simply because they were ignored for too long. Jean welcomed him back without conditions. No lectures, no rehearsed speeches, just space. She told me later that she'd spent months questioning her own memory, wondering if she truly had been as cruel as she'd been made to feel. Reconnecting with her son didn't erase that damage, but it grounded her again in reality. Ruby, from what I observed at a distance, never reframed her story. She remained the one who had been mistreated, misunderstood, unsupported in her version. The ending made sense because it preserved the role she needed to survive. And that's the thing about strategic victimhood. It doesn't collapse easily, it adapts. When I last spoke to Isaac, he said something quietly, almost to himself. He said he'd confused empathy with surrender. That he thought loving someone meant believing them, no matter what. Even when his own instincts were slowly being trained into silence. He wasn't bitter. He was reflective. He said he was learning how to listen without disappearing. That marriage didn't end in anger or betrayal or scandal. It ended in exhaustion. The kind that comes from constantly carrying someone else's pain as proof of your devotion. Watching it from the outside, I was struck by how different this story looked from Claire's. One woman had been pushed out by a mother who needed to suffer, the other by a wife who needed to be. Different roles. Same mechanism. And as I packed up my notes from that vineyard, I remember thinking that I'd seen this dynamic play out one more time than I cared to admit. Because when money enters the picture, when generosity becomes leverage, when suffering is used as currency, the performance gets sharper, colder, more calculated. That realization came into full focus at a private mountain lodge in Aspen, where the woman at the center of the story didn't cry quietly or isolate slowly. She paid, and every dollar came with a reminder of how much it hurt her to do so. Aspen has a way of sharpening everything. The air feels thinner, the stakes feel higher, and people arrive already, performing a version of themselves they want remembered. The wedding at the private mountain lodge was no exception. It was polished, secluded, and expensive in a way that doesn't announce itself loudly. It assumes you already know. The bride was Amelia Roth. She was composed, deliberate, and acutely aware of what this wedding represented beyond romance. The groom, Carter Roth, came from a family where money didn't just solve problems, it defined relationships. And at the center of everything stood his mother, Doris Roth. Doris didn't smile often. When she did, it felt measured, as if warmth were a resource she dispensed carefully. She spoke plainly, avoided unnecessary emotion, and made it clear from the beginning that she was underwriting a significant portion of the wedding, not as a gift, exactly, more as an investment in how things should be done. From our very first meeting, Doris positioned herself as the quiet backbone of the event. She reminded everyone, casually, of deposits she'd covered and vendors she preferred. She framed every intervention as efficiency, as experience, as protecting the couple from mistakes they didn't yet understand. Amelia was grateful and cautious. She tried to keep decisions collaborative, looping Doris in without surrendering authority. Carter, meanwhile, floated between them, confident that his mother's involvement came from generosity, not control. He'd grown up inside this dynamic. It felt normal to him. The lodge itself required precision. Vendor access windows were tight. Weather contingencies had to be planned weeks in advance. Budget approvals affected everything from lighting to transportation. And Doris made sure every approval passed through her. She never said no outright. She paused. She asked questions. She reminded us of costs already incurred. And when Amelia hesitated or suggested an alternative, Doris didn't argue. She looked hurt. She would say things like, "I thought this was what you wanted," or "I only stepped in because I didn't want you stressed." She spoke about how exhausting it was to carry so much responsibility, how unappreciated it sometimes felt. Victimhood doesn't always cry. Sometimes it invoices. The first real discomfort surfaced around vendor authority. Doris contacted the caterer directly, adjusting menu details she felt better suited the family's image. When Amelia found out, Doris apologized immediately. She said she hadn't realized it crossed a line, that she was just trying to help, that she felt embarrassed for assuming. Amelia accepted the apology. She didn't want tension. Not this close to the date. But the pattern continued. Timeline tweaks. Seating adjustments. Quiet changes approved with Doris's signature, not the couple's. Each time, Doris expressed regret paired with justification. Each time, she reminded everyone how much she'd contributed. By the time we reached the final budget review, it was clear the wedding no longer belonged fully to the couple. It belonged to the person who could frame control as sacrifice. And the higher we climbed into the mountains, the heavier that sacrifice seemed to become. Because when money becomes proof of love, refusing it starts to look like cruelty. And Doris was just beginning to test how much discomfort her generosity could buy. The first time Amelia tried to say no, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even emotional. It was practical. She wanted to adjust the reception timeline slightly, moving a formal moment earlier so guests wouldn't be waiting between courses. It was a small change, one that made logistical sense. Doris listened, nodded, and then said she worried it would feel rushed. She reminded Amelia how much thought she'd already put into the flow of the evening. She mentioned, almost offhandedly, how difficult it had been coordinating vendors at that altitude. Then she went quiet. Carter noticed immediately. He asked if everything was okay. Doris said she was just tired, that she hadn't expected planning to be so draining, that she felt like she was carrying more than she'd anticipated. Amelia backed off. That pattern repeated itself. Whenever Amelia asserted a preference, Doris responded with weariness, with subtle disappointment. With reminders of effort and expense, the boundary wasn't challenged head-on, it was made to feel ungrateful. The most revealing test came when Amelia asked to approve all vendor changes before they were finalized. She framed it carefully, emphasizing coordination and clarity. Doris looked at her for a long moment and said she felt blindsided. She said she thought they trusted her. She said it hurt to be treated like an outsider after everything she'd paid for. Paid for. The word hung in the air. Carter intervened, suggesting they all take a breath. He reassured his mother that she was appreciated. He asked Amelia to understand where Doris was coming from. Amelia agreed. Again, I watched it happen with that familiar tension in my chest. Because boundaries tested through guilt don't collapse loudly, they erode. As the wedding drew closer, Doris began approving expenses unilaterally. Upgrades appeared without discussion. Additional services were booked just in case. Each one accompanied by a comment about not wanting the couple to worry about cost. But worry was the point. Because every dollar spent without consent became another reminder of obligation. Another reason Amelia felt she couldn't push back. When Amelia tried to thank Doris to acknowledge the generosity, Doris responded with something that made the room go still. She said she hoped the wedding wouldn't make her look controlling. It wasn't a question, it was a warning. From that moment on, Amelia felt trapped. Saying yes reinforced the narrative of sacrifice. Saying no risked being framed as ungrateful, cold, dismissive of everything Doris had done. The boundary had been tested. And once again, it had bent. But unlike the other stories I've told, this one didn't rely on silence or isolation. It relied on leverage. And Doris was about to use it in front of everyone. The escalation arrived, disguised as generosity. 2 days before the wedding, Doris called an unscheduled meeting with the venue coordinator and several vendors. She didn't announce it as a takeover. She framed it as a final check-in. A courtesy, she said, because she didn't want Amelia feeling overwhelmed so close to the ceremony. Amelia found out afterward, changes had been approved. Not catastrophic ones. Just enough to alter the tone. A different lighting package that emphasized formality. A revised seating flow that placed Doris's side of the family closer to the couple. A tightened reception timeline that prioritized speeches over open celebration. When Amelia questioned it, Doris looked genuinely wounded. She said she'd only stepped in because she felt responsible. That when you pay this much, you worry. That she'd been losing sleep thinking about how guests might perceive the evening. Perceive. Image had always been the undercurrent. Carter tried to smooth things over. He told Amelia it wasn't worth fighting days before the wedding. He told Doris they appreciated everything she was doing. He asked both women to focus on the bigger picture. The bigger picture, it seemed, belonged to Doris. On the wedding day itself, the lodge buzzed with restrained tension. Staff moved carefully, aware that every adjustment had to be cleared through Doris. When Amelia asked for a last-minute change to the ceremony order, the coordinator hesitated and quietly asked if Doris had approved it. I watched Amelia's expression tighten, not with anger, with realization. The ceremony was flawless, beautiful, controlled. Doris sat in the front row, posture perfect, expression solemn. When Amelia walked down the aisle, Doris dabbed at her eyes, visibly moved. Guests whispered about how emotional she seemed, how generous she'd been, how much she clearly loved her son. At the reception, Doris insisted on speaking. No one objected. She stood slowly, glass in hand, and thanked everyone for coming. She spoke about family, about sacrifice, about how difficult it is to let go when you've given so much of yourself. Then she said something that made the room shift. She said she'd worried throughout the planning process that she might be overstepping, that she'd feared being seen as controlling when all she'd done was support the couple financially and emotionally. She said she hoped Amelia understood how much love had gone into every decision. It sounded gracious. It was surgical. Every sentence reframed control as burden, every dollar as suffering, and every boundary Amelia had tried to set as potential cruelty. I glanced at Amelia. She smiled politely, hands folded, absorbing the moment without reacting. Carter avoided her eyes. After the speech, guests lined up to hug Doris. They praised her generosity. They thanked her for making such a beautiful wedding possible. Amelia received compliments too, but they were different. Focused on aesthetics, on execution, not on effort or intention. Later that evening, Amelia pulled me aside. She didn't cry, she laughed quietly, the kind of laugh people make when they've reached clarity through exhaustion. She said she finally understood. This wedding had never been about celebrating her marriage. It had been about proving how much Doris had endured to make it happen. And now that proof had been delivered publicly and permanently. What followed wasn't an explosion, it was a withdrawal. After the wedding, the mountains emptied out. Guests returned to their lives. Vendors closed their invoices. The lodge went quiet again, and in that quiet, the consequences began to settle. Doris didn't confront Amelia. She didn't complain. She didn't demand gratitude. She simply continued the story she'd told at the reception. She mentioned, casually, to relatives how exhausting the planning process had been, how she worried she might have pushed too hard without realizing it, how sensitive Amelia seemed under pressure. She framed everything as reflection, not criticism, and people responded exactly as she expected. They reassured her. They told her she'd done more than enough. They praised her generosity. Some even suggested she'd take a step back now after everything she'd been through. Amelia noticed the shift immediately. Invitations to casual family gatherings stopped including her directly. Conversations felt polite but distant. Compliments came wrapped in sympathy for Doris instead of joy for the newlyweds. Nothing overt had changed. Everything had. Carter struggled at first to name what was wrong. He told Amelia she might be reading too much into things, that his mother was just decompressing after the stress of the wedding, that it would pass, but it didn't. Every attempt Amelia made to establish normalcy was met with a reminder of the past. A comment about how hard that time was, a reference to how much Doris had sacrificed, an unspoken expectation that gratitude should still be flowing. The power dynamic hadn't ended with the wedding, it had simply moved off stage. The breaking point came months later during a conversation about future holidays. Amelia suggested hosting one year. Doris hesitated, then said she wasn't sure she could handle being a guest instead of helping, that it might feel strange after everything she'd done. Helping, Amelia finally said what she'd been holding back since Aspen. She said she appreciated Doris's contributions, but that she needed a relationship not built on debt. She said she couldn't keep living inside a narrative where love was measured by suffering. Doris went very still. She said she felt attacked. She said she couldn't believe Amelia would speak to her that way after all she'd given. She said she felt used. The story snapped back into place instantly. Within days, the distance became official. Doris remained cordial but cool. She stopped initiating contact. She told people she was giving the couple space to build their life. It sounded generous. It was strategic. The social consequence wasn't exile or confrontation, it was quiet distance. And for Amelia, that distance felt like relief. Amelia didn't mourn the distance the way people expected her to. There was no dramatic grief, no desperate attempt to repair what had broken. What she felt instead was space, the kind that lets you breathe for the first time without calculating what it costs. She and Carter talked more honestly in the months that followed than they had during the entire planning process. Without invoices and timelines to hide behind, the dynamic became impossible to ignore. Carter admitted he'd never questioned the way his mother framed generosity. He'd grown up believing love came with obligation, and obligation came with silence. Recognizing that didn't mean cutting her out completely, it meant redefining access. They kept holidays simple, short visits, neutral locations, clear starts and clear endings. Doris remained polite, distant, occasionally wounded. But without the leverage of money or public performance, her suffering no longer dictated the terms of the relationship. And that was the quiet resolution. Not reconciliation, not revenge, just limits that held. When I think back on all 3 weddings, the pattern feels painfully clear. Different settings, different women, the same mechanism at work, victimhood used as currency. In Charleston, a mother framed exclusion as cruelty until a marriage began under quiet humiliation. In Napa, a wife rewrote reality until isolation became proof of devotion. In Aspen, a matriarch paid for control and called it sacrifice. None of these women shouted. None of them threatened. They suffered, and in doing so, they shaped entire family systems around their pain. I've learned that the most dangerous phrase I hear during wedding planning isn't, "I'm paying for this," or "this is my tradition." It's, "I'm just hurt," because when hurt becomes identity, someone else always has to carry the blame. And weddings, for all their beauty, have a way of revealing exactly who is willing to do that. If you've ever felt yourself shrinking to protect someone else's feelings, or watched a celebration turn into a performance of sacrifice, you're not imagining it. You're seeing a story being written in real time. And the only way it ever changes is when someone decides to step out of it, quietly, firmly, for good. I've seen enough weddings to know this isn't rare. These aren't extreme cases pulled from the edge of human behavior. They're quiet patterns that repeat because they work. Victimhood works because it recruits allies without asking permission. It works because it reframes power as pain and control as sacrifice. And it works especially well in families where love is supposed to mean tolerance, patience, and silence. What stays with me isn't the dresses or the venues or the budgets that spiral out of control. It's the moment when someone realizes they've been managing another person's emotions at the cost of their own reality. That realization never looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like distance, like fewer conversations, like choosing peace over performance. If any part of these stories felt familiar to you, that's not an accident. Most people don't recognize these dynamics until they've lived inside them, until they've apologized for things they didn't do, until they've been told they're cold for finally drawing a line. And I'm always curious what moment would have changed everything for you. Because in every wedding I've planned, there's a moment where someone could have said no sooner, or spoken up louder, or stepped back without explaining themselves at all. And those moments, they're different for everyone. So if you've been listening and thinking about where you would have drawn the line, you're not alone. That question follows these stories long after the vows are over. I'll be here, telling the ones I've seen up close. The beautiful ones, the uncomfortable ones. The stories that remind us that not every smiling family photo tells the truth. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a wedding reveals is who finally stops playing along. I've planned hundreds of weddings over the years, from quiet backyard ceremonies to 7-figure events where every fork, every flower, every chair placement carries a message. And if there's one thing I've learned the hard way, it's this. Weddings don't create family conflicts. They expose the ones that were already there, hiding just beneath the surface, waiting for an audience. People think the biggest wedding disasters are about money or weather or late vendors, but the most destructive moments I've witnessed never showed up on invoices. They came wrapped in soft voices, trembling hands, and carefully chosen words. They came from women who knew exactly how to suffer in public, how to cry without tears, how to look wounded while quietly pulling every string behind the scenes. I'm Emily Carter. I'm a wedding planner. And for over a decade, I've stood in rooms where love was supposed to take center stage, only to watch power, control, and emotional manipulation steal the spotlight. I don't tell these stories to shame anyone. I tell them because once you've seen these patterns enough times, you can't unsee them. And because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone feels sorry for. The first wedding that comes to mind whenever I hear someone say, "She just feels left out," took place in Charleston, South Carolina. At a historic waterfront venue that looked like it belonged on the cover of a bridal magazine, soft white columns, sweeping oaks, water glinting in the background, it was the kind of setting people assume guarantees a happy ending. The bride's name was Claire Whitmore. She was thoughtful, organized, and quietly exhausted in that way I recognize instantly now. The groom, Logan Whitmore, loved her deeply. But he carried a kind of emotional tension that never fully left his shoulders. And then there was his mother, Evelyn Whitmore. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't make dramatic demands. In fact, when I first met her, I remember thinking she was refreshingly hands-off for a mother-in-law funding part of an upscale Southern wedding. She smiled politely, spoke softly, and kept her comments vague. Almost too vague. She would say things like, "I don't want to be in the way," or "I know this isn't really my place," while somehow always being present when decisions were made. She framed every concern as a feeling, never a demand, and that made her impossible to challenge without looking cruel. From the very beginning, Claire tried. She included Evelyn in tastings, asked her opinion on floral styles, even invited her to a dress fitting that most brides would keep sacred. But nothing seemed to land. Every gesture was met with a small sigh, a tight smile, a comment about how things are just different now. The first real tension appeared around the guest list. Charleston venues are beautiful, but they are unforgiving when it comes to capacity. Every additional chair ripples through catering, rentals, and layout approvals. Claire and Logan had agreed on a number that fit both their budget and the space. A week later, Logan called me sounding uneasy. He said his mother felt hurt, not angry, not demanding, hurt. Apparently, she had discovered that several distant cousins and longtime family friends weren't on the list. People she believed would expect to be there. When Claire gently explained the limitations, Evelyn didn't argue. She simply said she felt excluded from the process, that she worried Claire didn't respect the family's traditions, that she felt like a guest at her own son's wedding. I remember standing in the venue office, phone pressed to my ear, feeling that familiar tightening in my stomach. Because I'd heard this before, when someone frames logistics as emotional rejection, the conversation stops being about facts and starts being about loyalty. Logan began making adjustments without looping Claire in. A few names added here, a few minor changes there. Each one justified as keeping the peace. Each one subtly shifting the balance of power. Then came the ceremony seating. In Southern weddings, this is not a small detail. Where someone sits says everything about their status, their role, their importance. Claire had planned a layout that honored both families equally. Evelyn saw it differently. She never demanded a change. She simply mentioned, tearfully, that sitting where she was placed made her feel invisible. That people would talk, that she worried others might think she'd done something wrong as a mother. By the time the rehearsal rolled around, the seating had been rearranged. Quietly, without Claire's approval, I watched Claire stand there, hands clasped, trying to understand how decisions kept being made around her instead of with her. I watched Logan avoid her eyes, caught between his mother's wounded expressions and his fiancée's growing confusion. And I knew then, long before the wedding day arrived, that this wasn't about being left out at all. This was about control disguised as pain. The wedding day arrived calm and bright. Evelyn arrived just late enough to shift the rhythm. Chairs were moved, rows adjusted. Claire found out by accident, moments before the ceremony. She didn't cry, she went quiet. The ceremony was beautiful. The reception even more so. And then Evelyn stood to speak. She talked about how hard it is for a mother to let go, about not knowing where you fit anymore, about loving quietly and hoping to grow closer someday. The room went still. It wasn't an insult, it was a narrative. Afterward, people hugged Evelyn. They praised her courage. Claire received compliments on flowers and food, not on endurance. Weeks later, family dynamics shifted. Conversations cooled, invitations changed. And when Claire finally spoke up, calmly and privately, she was told her feelings might be stress, projection, misunderstanding. That was when the relationship ended, not in an explosion, but in distance. Freedom, for Claire, came at the cost of reputation. And sometimes, that's the price of stepping out of someone else's story. That realization followed me to Napa Valley, where the problem wasn't a mother who needed to feel excluded. It was a wife who needed to be Ruby Kensington, was soft-spoken and constantly worried about being misunderstood. Her husband Isaac loved her deeply. He protected her, and slowly, without realizing it, he disappeared for her comfort. Messages were reframed, neutral comments became attacks. Distance was called healing. Isolation followed. By the time the truth surfaced, the marriage was already exhausted. Not broken by betrayal, but by a reality that couldn't be shared anymore. When it ended, Isaac didn't feel anger. He felt older. And then there was Aspen. Amelia Roth married into a family where money didn't just support love, it defined it. Doris Roth paid generously and suffered publicly for it. Every dollar carried meaning. Every approval came with expectation. Control wasn't demanded. It was justified. The wedding was flawless. The speech was gracious. And the suffering was unmistakable. Afterward, Amelia chose quiet distance. Clear limits. No spectacle. And for the first time, the power shifted. Looking back at all three weddings, the pattern is clear. Victimhood used as currency. Different roles, same mechanism. The most dangerous phrase I hear during wedding planning isn't, "I'm paying for this." It's, "I'm just hurt." Because when hurt becomes identity, someone else always has to carry the blame. Weddings reveal that better than almost anything else. And sometimes, the bravest choice isn't confrontation. It's stepping out of the story, quietly, firmly, for good. Because when hurt becomes identity, someone else always has to carry the blame. I've seen that play out more clearly at weddings than anywhere else in my career. Not because weddings are dramatic by nature, but because they remove the usual exits. You can't walk away. You can't change the subject. You can't pretend something didn't happen when 200 people watched it happen with a smile. What stays with me isn't the moment someone is hurt. It's the moment that hurt becomes useful. When suffering starts shaping decisions, when discomfort becomes leverage, when someone learns that the more wounded they appear, the more control they're allowed to keep, that's when the dynamic hardens. And from that point on, nothing is ever really about the wedding anymore. It's about who gets to feel offended without consequence, who gets comfort instead of accountability, who gets to rewrite every disagreement as proof that they're being mistreated. I've watched couples exhaust themselves trying to manage that imbalance, softening words, making exceptions, adjusting plans, believing that if they just handled things better, the tension would ease. It never does, because the story requires a villain. And once that role is assigned, everything you do feeds it. What usually surprises people is how little drama follows when someone finally stops participating. There's no explosion, no apology that changes anything, no final conversation that brings clarity. There's just distance, fewer calls, shorter visits. Decisions made without explanation, a life that slowly reorganizes itself around peace instead of permission. From the outside, it can look cold. From the inside, it feels inevitable. Weddings don't end these dynamics. They crystallize them. They show you who needs to be the victim, who needs to be admired for suffering, and who is expected to absorb the cost of that suffering quietly. And once you've seen that pattern clearly, it's very hard to unsee it, especially when you realize how often it's rewarded. When I look back at all 3 weddings, what stays with me isn't the drama people noticed. It's the pattern they didn't. Different families, different personalities, different settings. The same emotional weapon used again and again. In Charleston, a mother framed exclusion as cruelty until her son started making decisions behind his fiancé's back. In Napa, a wife rewrote neutral moments as attacks until isolation became proof of loyalty. In Aspen, a matriarch paid for control and called it sacrifice, letting her suffering speak louder than consent ever could. None of these women needed to raise their voices. They didn't have to. They positioned themselves as wounded. And once that role was accepted, everything else fell into place. Sympathy replaced scrutiny. Comfort replaced accountability. And anyone who pushed back suddenly looked cold, ungrateful, or cruel. That's what makes this dynamic so effective. When someone always needs to be the injured party, someone else is quietly assigned the role of villain. Weddings don't create these power struggles. They expose them under pressure, in public, with money and reputation on the line. They show you who gets protected, who gets believed, and who is expected to absorb the emotional cost so the peace can be preserved. What happens after the wedding is rarely dramatic. It's distance, it's silence, it's relationships that never fully recover. And from the outside, it often looks like nothing happened at all. That's why these stories matter. Because if you've ever felt yourself shrinking to avoid being seen as the problem, if you've ever been told someone was just hurt while you were the one adjusting, apologizing, or disappearing, then you already understand how this works. So I'll leave you with the question I always end up asking myself after weddings like these. Where would you have drawn the line? If you enjoy real behind-the-scenes wedding stories like this, subscribe band. Tell me in the comments which woman you think used victimhood most strategically, and whether you believe any of these outcomes could have been avoided. I'll keep telling the stories I've seen up close, the ones people smile through, and the ones that quietly change everything once the wedding is over.